For today, however, we have our Bristol Law Society's training on climate change risk with our good friends at Landmark Information, looking specifically at the Law Society's climate change risk practice note with guidance for solicitors handling property transactions. I should note that's guidance from the National Law Society of England and Wales, but not us here at Bristol Law Society. Bristol Law Society isn't qualified to give this kind of advice, and that is why we are very grateful to Landmark Information for partnering with us today. We're joined by Ali Parsons and Simon Boyle, who are our dedicated subject matter experts. We expect there will be plenty of time at the end within our hour for questions, so do please make use of the chat function to post any questions, and we will address these at the end if they haven't already been covered in the presentation. Thank you very much. Ali.
Thank you very much, Leon. Thank you, everybody, for joining the session today. So, as Leon said, this is about climate change risk in property transactions, and really around the recently published practice note that came out in May 12th, and followed that guidance in 2023. And kind of, from that guidance, what was required was from the property professionals was, can we be a bit more property specific and, really kind of understand how that is applied when you're talking about your own property transactions for your clients. So hopefully the session today will provide that, very thing. What does it mean in practice? How do you ensure that you both address and advise clients on climate risk, whether that's a residential or commercial transaction, and you do that appropriately? So I'm trying to do the slides. We'll be doing the slide deck on behalf of my colleague Simon Boyle. And Simon is an environmental lawyer and director for Landmark Information, and has been party to the practice note. So some good advice from an experienced and knowledgeable person coming up. So we'll look through the summary of the Law Society practice note just to keep you up to date. We'll look through the different climate risks that evolved as part of property transactions, and then obviously how you advise that to your client, and putting those simple steps into practice, and then we'll finish up with just looking at the Landmark climate module, so you've got a good understanding of what Landmark's products, kind of the data and assessment that we include in our reports. So I'm going to hand you over to Simon, who's going to run through that summary. So over to you, Simon.
Thanks very much, Ali. Hello, everybody. Can't see anybody, but thank you for joining us today. So yeah, the Law Society practice note on property. Let's have a look at that and what it's all about. So as Ali sort of set the background here, in April 2023, so just over 2 years ago, the Law Society issued its sort of general guidance on climate change. It took the view that climate change, we all know it's here. The Law Society needs to engage with that, and solicitors need to engage. So it sort of publishes fairly sort of generic guidance, and it said we will be bringing out sector specific practice notes on this. On climate change, and the first of those was on property, and interestingly, it wasn't long after they published the guidance that they started looking at bringing out this property practice note, and I remember that I think it was around sort of September 2023 you started getting the email saying, would you like to be involved in this? And that I got involved because I've for many years been a member of UKLA. I don't know if you know UKLA. It's a fantastic organisation, United Kingdom Environmental Law Association, and obviously we're environmental lawyers basically. And in fact, funnily enough, in the 20th of June, we're all going to be in Bristol. We're going to have about 300 environmental lawyers at Bristol University. That's our UKLA annual conference. I'll be over there. So anybody's going along, if you are going along to that, it'd be great to meet up. But anyway, that's how I got involved in the practice note, and we had all these drafts going backwards and forwards, and on the first sort of couple of drafts, it's all very exciting, new, and then by about draft 6, you're going, oh gosh, not another draft to look through. Anyway, it came out as Ali said, just a month or so ago, or May in May, but more than a month. And a lot of time was spent putting it together. So I would hope that people don't see this as like an extra set of burdens that Law Society is trying to push onto solicitors. That's not its objective at all. I think it's just recognizing that climate change is here, and we need to do something about it. It is obviously going to affect properties. And I think on the whole, it's fairly sort of common sense, really. I don't think there's anything that you go, oh my gosh, this is a completely different way I've got to look at transactions at all. And we'll see why as we go through this. So anyway, hopefully, it'll all make sense and nobody will be unduly worried about it. So on to the sort of the next slide there. So I guess the first point is, right, I'm just seeing that I've been highlighted, which is slightly off-putting, but seeing myself there. But the first thing, right at the start, it says this is for solicitors who handle property transactions, whether it's commercial or residential, or you could be a commercial lawyer but dealing with properties. This is going to be relevant. So that sort of sets the scene. It's all properties. It was in England and Wales. So they don't have the same equivalent in Scotland at the moment. So there we are. That's the beginning of the practice note. It's on solicitors and it's all properties. So have a look at the next slide. And then what it does, it lists the 3 types of risks that need to be considered. Physical risks, we'll look at those. What is called transition risks, again, we'll look at those, and the legal or liability risks, which essentially flow from or can flow from physical and transition risks. And I guess an obvious point to make is that the key difference, I suppose, to climate change to other risks that we've always had to look at as solicitors are that they're looking into the future, and nobody really knows what the future holds. So you're assessing risk or we are at Landmark as best we can with the data we've got, but nobody knows really what's going to be happening over the next, to the end of the year, which is when we're sort of looking at climate change. So, but why are we having to look at it kind of now? Why weren't we looking at it 10 years ago, and why have we chosen this time? And I think it's because whilst climate change scientists have been saying for many years, since the first IPCC reports came out, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in 1992, since we've had those, and climate scientists are saying, look, we've got to do something about this. It's really important. And international community has been having various agreements saying, okay, this is how we're going to tackle climate change. We've got to really bring in our carbon emissions from the burning of fossil fuels, obviously coal, oil, and gas, principally. And in the Paris Agreement of 2015, they're saying, okay, we've got to make sure that we keep global emissions, global temperatures well within 2 degrees C, and if we can, at 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's what they're saying, and that is compared to pre-industrial levels. That's what it's all about, pre-industrial levels, before we really started burning fossil fuels. But last year was the first year we exceeded Paris. We've already broken that important sort of benchmark that was set internationally. We've crossed that barrier, really, and we know now it's a serious issue. We know we're being affected. Other parts of the world, of course, we've been hearing about what's been going on in Antarctica and places like that, right across the world, for a long time. But now I think we're realizing it is starting to affect the UK. And how in the UK? Well, again, this is not new. Climate change scientists have been saying this for many years, but basically in the UK, the trend is for milder, wetter winters and hotter, drier summers. Now, I know today it's not particularly hot or dry, but is the trend. I think we've got some hot weather coming through, and what that means for property and property lawyers is wet winters. You've got more rain, more properties can be at risk of flooding, and hot dry summers. In some areas, especially in sort of London areas and southeast, where you've got clay, that clay will shrink when it's really hot and lack of water, and that can and will cause subsidence in properties. And so they're the two major reasons why property lawyers need to know about this, because of those two things, really. So that's why we're having to look at it. And so then I've just put up this graph because it's like, well, how bad is climate change going to get? And the answer is we don't know. I mentioned Paris. So the sort of the blue thing there, the blue line is this is what Paris is trying to achieve: no more than 2 degrees centigrade. As I said, we've broken that. And by the way, if you look at these figures where it's got RCP, that's representative concentration pathways, they're set by scientists. 2.6, which you can see there, and 4.5 in the green, they're not the temperatures. That's how much extra wattage is going to be falling on the Earth as a result of the global warming. So they're not the temperatures. The temperatures are then, as you see, follow. So RCP 4.5 is where we sort of seem to be now, and that's saying global temperatures increasing by 2.4 degrees by the end of the century. Although the latest indication that the latest estimate from the UN was 2.9 degrees C, so the higher end of 4.5, and that is not good. That means climate change is going to get much worse. So it's not at the moment a good news story. We have to do much more, obviously, to bring those down. And in this country, we're trying to do that through our net zero targets. So the next slide.
Just a point here is to kind of say that these RCPs, really, this is the trajectory. So this is how we're using these trajectories to help measure the data that we use within the reports, and so that kind of gives some example of what we can hopefully try and predict. That's kind of how we're using this information within the reports.
That's a really important point. Thanks, Sally. Yeah, so we've set our reports at 4.5 because that's where we seem to be. So the landmark reports, the main measure we use in our reports is 4.5. So we're sort of following the best science that we can, and that trajectory is where we're looking at in our models. So physical risks. Well, when we were looking at, writing the practice note, what were the key physical risks, and we listed those out there. Now, some of those are risks we're already well aware of and been looking at. Flood is the obvious example. We've been looking at flood since the practice note came out, and when it was 2008, something like that. That's not new for us. Likewise, ground stability and coastal erosion. Heat stress is a bit newer. And then we've got what we call emerging risks, wildfires and water scarcity. Now, other parts of the world, obviously, wildfires can be massive. Not long ago, of course, we had what was going on in Los Angeles and all those terrible scenes from there at the end of last year. And water scarcity is beginning to affect the UK. I saw in the news a couple of days ago a picture of Haweswater in the Lake District. That's half empty because they depend in the northwest, depend on reservoirs. We are most certainly going to have bigger issues with water scarcity in this country, especially I think in the southeast. We've got a lot of population and lower rainfall. But these are the risks that we've listed out. Were listed out in the practice note. There's also extreme weather events is there, which landmark we're looking at that data as well on that. Anyway, they're the main ones, and each has its own sort of set of problems. We're just going to have a look at for the next few slides.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry. And just to say, there is also hopefully coming out pretty soon a supplementary technical note on these physical risks. And I actually wrote that with a colleague at Landmark and Professor Bob Lee at Birmingham University, who's a consultant who we work with. And the reason we thought, and we offered the Law Society to write this supplementary note, was because when it talks about, as you see from the practice note, whatever the risk might be, whether it's flooding, subsidence, or heat stress, we thought to give a bit more context could be useful for solicitors. So saving them having to go and Google things if they wanted to find out more, or their client wants to find out more, we thought we'd write that, and that's what we did. And it is to be linked with the practice note, but as far as I know, it's still not come through. I've asked the Law Society when that will be made. So we wrote that because we thought it might be helpful for solicitors and clients.
Yeah. And I think that one of the other things that's pointed out as well, Simon, with regards to physical risk, is that those 4 main risks that we highlight, so your flood, ground stability, coastal erosion, and heat stress, are kind of the ones that seem the most obvious at this point. And those emerging ones, there's still not enough really key data to kind of just, so it's really difficult if you're just thinking, oh, I'll get this because it looks like it's got the right data. Make sure that data has some reasoning and when we're currently making sure that we do a thorough search before we just put any data in. It's got to be right. But those 4 core ones are really kind of what they've highlighted as being the most important at this point.
Sally, for that.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so they're the physical risks. Was that all we had on physical risks? Right. Okay.
Yeah, then we go into the examples.
Oh, I forgot. Sorry, I thought I was going to talk more. Yeah, so yeah, that was. I thought I was going to make that point a bit later, actually, about those emerging risks. But just to sort of emphasise what Ali said on those, with wildfires and water stress, we're actively so I'm in our Brighton office, and we've got somebody who's an expert, or well, his master's on wildfires, so he's looking at the various wildfire data sets that we can be incorporating. We will be doing that. But it's a mistake. That's not the way Landmark works. Just to see the first data set you come across, it's all the data sets are absolutely scrutinised by our Exeter colleagues, our data team, to make sure they're as rigorous as possible. There's a lot of data out there, but it's selecting the right data sets. Obviously, whenever possible, we tend to use data sets from the sort of official sources like the BGS, who we work closely with, the Met Office, etc. So there's physical risks. Now looking at transition risks, and this is slightly different because transition risks are how we as a society are going to respond to climate change. We know we need to do something, and we have the Climate Change Act 2008 that which says that the country will be it's a legal obligation to reach net zero by 2080. Sorry, by 2050. 2050, and that is no mean task. That is no mean task. And so what we're having to do is move away from using fossil fuels and move to renewable sources, i.e., going from not using coal, and we know that the coal-fired power stations have closed down now. But we're still using a lot of oil, we're still using a lot of gas, and there's still fossil fuels. And we are moving to a lot more use of wind, in particular onshore, offshore, and solar farms. So that journey's underway, but there's still an awful long way to go. And this is just showing you kind of that journey that we're on. And that matters. And I think we've got some electors. You can see when it comes to properties, so 17% of all UK emissions now are related to heating and building property. That's a very high amount. We've got to really push that down, and the government is wanting to reduce that by about around 50% by 2035. That's only 10 years' time. How on earth are they going to do that? And the main piece of legislation they're now doing that, as I'm sure you all know, is obviously MEES. And EPCs with the energy performance certificates, and we're going to see that ratcheting down on efficiency. So yes, at the moment you can let with a if it's a D, but it's going to be a If you're a landlord, then it's going to be a C, and they just keep tightening and tightening up, those requirements. If they don't, we're never going to meet our net zero target. So once you're on that journey, you just got to get stricter and stricter, and that is obviously going to affect your clients buying, especially letting property with landlords. So yes, you can have a property that complies now with the legislation and meets with MEES, but in 10 years it may no longer not comply. And this is where you just have to have that conversation with their client, so your client is aware of these risks. And if they want to go ahead with a building where it could be very, buying a building and letting it where it could be very difficult to improve the energy, well, that's something that they're going to have to think about. So it will affect, its decisions of whether or not to buy a property, or perhaps negotiate on the price if they know they're going to be having to spend an awful lot of it to improve the energy performance of that building. There's scope for negotiations, because everybody buying that property ought to be asking the same questions. So and that is spelt out in the practice note. A property that currently complies with relevant legislation may no longer comply following these changes. But transition risks, we're going to see a lot more of this. We're going to see a lot more policy coming in through from the government, and new regulations. But it's not just regulatory drivers. It's just the way that, say, businesses start changing their behaviours, and even we as individuals do things differently. Now moving on to legal risk, and this is where really lawyers, need to think about. This is where the legal assessments come in. It's not, as a lawyer, your job is not to advise on the details of physical risks. There you'd have to, you refer to a surveyor if people want the detail about a substance or something like that. But where you do need to turn your mind is to these legal risks. So these are, could there be liability or legal risks flowing from a physical or a transition risk? And the practice note gives a few examples of these. One that I've added in here, most of these are taken from the practice note, but one that I added in is where you have a property which is at high risk of flooding and you can't get insurance. Now that's already been something we've had to think about as solicitors, since we had the flood practice note. But this is sort of becoming even more highlighted, I think, because of climate change, because we know many more properties will be at risk of flooding. And so if you buy a property, it may be at moderate risk of flooding at the moment, but in 20 years may be at high risk of flooding. And if in extreme cases, it could be very difficult or indeed impossible to get insurance. And obviously with residential, we have flood re there. Flood re is due to end in 2039. So you could get a lot of properties where it's going to be very hard to get insurance. And that's obviously going to massively affect the value of that property, because a lender or building society will want to know that property is insurable, otherwise they won't lend. So you can just see there, these are legal risks. Another one might be, again, flood related, where you're a riparian owner and the Environment Agency is serving a notice on you to do certain works on your property to prevent localized flooding. And if you just don't do that, then they can serve you with the notice. So there's all sorts of ways, and we've talked about MEES already, where you could see that there could be legal risks flowing from climate change and the physical changes going on, and indeed the transition changes. What I think would be really interesting is if we all sort of meet back up in, I don't know, two years' time and hear stories of where we're seeing these legal risks arising. So let's now look about when you're sitting down with your client and what you're going to say. And I think the advice that you're going to give is really quite contextual in nature. One thing may be, the sophistication of the client. If it's, highly sophisticated commercial client, they may know all about climate change. They've got their own environmental advisor or even climate advisor, and that they don't really need you to say very much to them. And it's also, you know, on the other extreme, people who know very little about it at all. So you do need to explain the potential risks. But it's also about what that client is looking to do with this property. If they're looking to hold it for just a short time, say, you know, a lease of 2 years, they're probably not going to be too worried about, you know, what it's going to be like in 2050. So they may not even want you to do a climate change. So they may say, please don't do a climate research. It's not needed. So the context of who your client is and the transaction, I think, will be important. So, but you'll know that, you know, and how that works. So in terms of the advising the client, the sort of these steps are set out in the practice note. When we were drafting it again, we thought it'd be quite helpful to have a sort of simple checklist. I was very keen to have that, and initially we drafted something that myself and one other person drafted this sort of checklist, and it went into as an appendix. And then anyway, over time, it became into the main body of the report. But anyway, we hope that it would be useful to have a sort of checklist, simple checklist, and this is what it is really. So initially, it's just having that discussion with your client if you think it's necessary. That climate risk is there and can cause issues. You could suggest that a climate risk search is one way to find out how you can find that information, and there's a whole section in the practice notes at 3.4 about climate researchers. So that's all very obvious. Then that there could be potential liabilities coming out of that. So if you are to do climate research in particular, and it's identifying risks, landmark reports sort of make those fairly clear by they're sort of in red on the front page. Then you need to start thinking about, could there be potential legal liabilities resulting from that? So, for example, high flood risk, you know, you've got to start thinking about that. So that's step 2. This is when you're considering whether the lender might also require a climate research. At the moment, I believe lenders aren't saying, solicitors, you must carry these out. They're saying, just do your normal searches, and it's up to you to decide what those normal search package is. So I think they're putting the onus at the moment on solicitors to make that judgment call. That might change within time. Lenders, of course, are doing their own assessments on climate risk in terms of their books, not on a property specific case, but looking at their portfolio. And then if the client, for whatever reason, there may be perfectly good reasons, doesn't want a climate risk search, worth putting that in writing. What is the client saying? Well, I'm going to talk to my surveyor. Actually, that's how I want to go about that. And if that's what they're saying, just jot that down on your file. Then it's on record. No, I don't need a climate risk search because I'm going to ask my surveyor. Fine, that's all recorded. It's not really your responsibility if they're going down that road. When you get, or if you get a climate risk search, then you've got to make it clear, and the practice note really makes it clear in several places. You're not an expert in this on physical risks to interpret those results, but you're sending the report to the client. You would be, I think, saying in your letter and report and title that these are the issues that are coming out of that, and you may want to follow up on this. And the best way to follow up, I think, in practice, is to contact. If it's a landmark report, they can ring up our customer service team who are experts on this. Then there's the put the relevant information report on title. In the report on title, there's a pretty useful precedent in the practice note itself that you can use. If your firm may have its own one, but otherwise there's a perfectly good one to start with in the practice note. And I think we'll be also talking about what Chancery Lane projects are doing in a second. I think we've got a slide on that. And then if you're acting for a lender, then and there's a climate change risk report that identifies things to inform the lender of that, so that they're informed it'd be unusual that they won't proceed. And that's basically, they're the steps. So it's nothing really new here, nothing where you're going, I've got to change the way I'm working. So it's all fairly straightforward. So what have we got here? We've got again, you are explaining to the client that you're not a technical expert, especially on the physical risks. You're looking at the legal consequences that flow. If the client wants to find out more about certain risk that's identified in a report, they can contact the search provider, i.e. Landmark, and we'll do our best to answer that. And what we've tried to do in this slide is this is more from a Landmark perspective as we see it, kind of simplifying those steps really when it comes to our reports. So and we put here, commission report when appropriate to do so. It's not always going to be appropriate to do a report, a climate risk report, and that is why we have a separate climate risk report. We deliberately haven't put our climate risk data and findings into our standard reports. Not now anyway, because we want people to have the choice. We don't have to force them to have climate risk.
It's in some reports, but not in all, Simon.
Pardon me, Ali?
Sorry, climate is in some of our reports.
So some of our reports.
Allow for that flexibility, yeah.
Some of our reports, but we always have the ability to buy a report without without that. If you don't want climate risk, then you don't, and you can just buy a separate climate risk report, which we have. So you get the report. If you get a report, you review it. The risks of, if they're of an issue, they'll be highlighted on the front page. You look at that, and the key thing is, of course, to communicate that to your client. What you don't want to do, and I'm sure nobody would do, is just send it to them without any comment. And we all know about the Bird and Bird case, where that happened in relation to a planning report, and it just simply sent it on without any comment. And why is the client going to look at it? They're not going to pick it up. So it is important to communicate that. And again, just to stress again, we've got an absolutely superb customer service team who can answer the questions, and I think we're well placed to deal with any of those. So that's really fairly straightforward.
Yeah, so kind of goes through it again.
yeah. And this is just to show you what our report looks like. So if something's fine, this is our EnviroSearch residential, isn't it? If something's fine, it's green, and if it's not fine, it's red. Anything to add on that, Ali?
Well, so like Simon said, if it's highlighted, so the climate change has got a red on it and it's saying identified, you need to go and discover what that is. And this information is the same within a separate report as it is within those reports that do include the climate change. So it's, look at the risks, but, look at what's today and what we're predicting as, round, as we said earlier, that RCP 4.5, because that's key to understanding, if that needs to be highlighted well and proper to your clients. And you've got to alert them to this, and and show them why that might be of concern. And you can simply copy and paste the information, the recommendations, into your summary and title.
The interesting thing here also is where it says RCP 4.5. That's what we were talking about before, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The trajectory that we have selected, which is where the climate scientists are saying we're on now. We wish it was, not as high risk as that, which is 2.5, but it is 4.5. That's just where we are.
Yeah, and each of the reports will be measured in a slightly different way, just to make sure that we're looking at the data and being able to do some form of prediction, because that's what it is really.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Oh yes. Here's the report on title that we have. So essentially, you've got a selection report on titles, or you may have your firm one initially, so which is great if they've got that. Otherwise, there's some wording in the practice note that I've mentioned, and the Chancery Lane project is also going to bringing out some wording that's called Marnie's clause. And then we got something from Landmark, and this is the Marnie's clause. I don't know how many people know about this Chancery Lane project, but basically they have a whole load of precedents that can be used, and what it's all about is trying to help this kind of journey towards net zero. Because if lawyers have easy to use clauses that have been drafted to help us transition onto net zero, sort of green leases and things like that, that seemed to be helpful. So that's what they're about. Marnie's clause was drafted when a solicitor has commissioned a climate report. When it was originally drafted, it didn't have the practice note out, so they contacted myself and Professor Bob Lee to review the clauses, which we have done. And we sent those away about a couple of weeks ago, and I think we're just waiting to hear back from them to get the final clause. So that's another one you can look at if you want to. So what we've done at Landmark is we've done a lot of work on climate change, clearly, but we have a whole sustainability team. I won't go through everybody on there, but there's actually now not actually everybody's on that list, but we're at least 10 of us now. And we cover a lot of areas. So we cover ESG, environment, social and governance. We do net zero. We do biodiversity, and of course we do climate change. And I think one of the key things behind all this is that everything's interlinked, and it enables us to take quite a holistic view. So yes, we've got a lot of information and data on climate risk, which is good, but we understand, I think, the interconnections with other aspects. So, for example, we're doing a lot of work on biodiversity net gains. If anybody's interested in that, we're very happy to talk to you about that. One affects the other quite clearly. So that's who our team is, and we obviously sit behind the customer service team, who are superb and be able to answer most questions. But if there's something particularly difficult, they can come to us, and we'll help with those questions. So that's how we sort of set things up. So what we've got now, examples.
We're going to look at just some examples, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, how you interpret them. That's right. So I think is this the one with this is the one with the coastal erosion, isn't it?
Yeah, so this is the coastal erosion.
Yeah,
So
we like this one.
Yeah, you've commissioned your
Aldborough.
report, and you see that there's coastal erosion has been identified. And obviously you need to find out that, what the detail is behind this. One of the things that we always do is put recommendations in there, so that you can see kind of what to do next almost. And you wouldn't see this information within the report. And but it's here to help describe, what is going on in this particular case and the geology behind it. I'm sure Sally my colleague is on this call, so hopefully I've not got this wrong, but the geology is made up of these different things. So marine beach deposits, till and road chalk foundation, all sort of erodible materials. And obviously on a coastline, that's not great, because obviously it's always going to continue to erode. But the key thing is to understand, if you've got that information, how can you find out what's happening and how quick is that erosion rate going to be? So you click onto the Environment Agency link, and it can provide you with that detail, really. So this particular coastline, I think, Simon, you actually investigated where it was and what's actually happening. But here it's saying there's going to be no active intervention. So this is something you definitely need to highlight to your client, because if it's on hold, what does that mean if you've about to purchase a property that's sat on that particular coast?
Yeah, I did have a look at this, as you say, and this is probably the area of the British Isles that is eroding most quickly. This area in North Yorkshire, because as you say, Ali, the very soft rocks, it's eroding at an average of 1.5 meters a year, which is a huge amount every year. And of course, it's getting worse because of climate change. And why is that? Well, it's because the sea level is rising, average of about 3 millimeters a year. So that's not helping. And also we're getting more storms. And it's a combination of those factors that mean that erosion rate is going to accelerate. And clearly, if somebody was buying a property there, you'd have to definitely take this into account, because how long are they going to actually be able to stay there before it will be in the sea? And then what is the environmental agency doing about that? Well, in that area, and nothing. It's letting natural forces just do their thing, really. They're not going to put a big concrete barrier up, right around the North Sea. So it's just one of those things we have to live with. So this would then be reported back to your client. Yeah, the question of insurance is often going to be the big question. Will you have to get insurance? So there's there are issues that are affecting the client clearly, and they need to think about that. They might be perfectly happy to go ahead and think, I only want to live there in my retirement for 30 years, but that's their decision.
So this next example is around the ground stability piece, and obviously subsidence. And Simon described, kind of what happens with clay when you've got that wetter winters and drier hot summers. So one's really making the clay swell, and the other is bringing it to shrink. So hence the subsidence. And this is an example of London clay site. You wouldn't see this particular map. This is something that was provided for us by Sally, who about the geology there, and showing exactly where that London clay sits for this particular property, and that it's got that highly effective change in moisture content. And is going to which is likely to increase, be worse as a result of climate change. So it's about, as Simon was saying earlier, speaking to a structural surveyor, making sure your client understands what that means for the shrink and swell, and removing any permeable surfaces with impermeable drives and paths to make that a lot better. And don't plant big trees close to the property, because you don't want them swelling out of the ground and then falling down once it's shrunken back. So just sort of simple things that perhaps you do now for ground stability, but obviously understanding that if it says moderate now, but to get worse is most likely going to get worse, then that's the bit you need to pay attention to. And then there's heat stress, which is all fairly new to most of us.
And interesting, just shows you how everything's interconnected, because yes, trees near properties aren't so good for subsidence, but they can actually be very good for cooling cities. So we would hope that as a result of government doing things because of climate risk, more trees in cities are good, because they can actually cool cities by as much as 2 degrees centigrade. So it shows you how complex it is. You might have one thing pulling one way and another. But heat stress is going to be a big concern, I think, in this country. We haven't really had to worry about it in the past very much, because we've had a very moderate climate. We haven't had really hot summers, and we don't tend to get really cold winters. So we haven't had to spend that much time building good properties with good thermal insulation. We've been able to get away with poor insulation because of our climate. That's starting to change. With hot summers, we will have buildings which simply be impossible to live in, whether it's working, or you can think of these big glass sort of 60s buildings, a lot of glass, no thermal insulation. They heat up really quickly and cool down really quickly. Going to be very hard to work in those. And again, with same with residential properties, there's things you can do. adding shutters and something like this, air conditioning, although in fact, you know, when you put in a heat pump for a property, we're looking at that, obviously that's where we're going to heat pumps. You can have a heat pump that's heating and also a heat pump that's cooling. So things like that need to be thought about by the client, really, how they're going to ensure that the property is going to be basically livable, whether it's for work or, you know, or to living in.
Yeah. I think, you know, I've got a property that is south facing, and, you know, whilst I purchased the property because of that, I soon realised that that meant very hot days and a conservatory that is not good to sit in. So when it's really, really hot. So it's about ensuring your client understands that, really, I guess. So we're going to look at climate module now. But you included this, Simon, as well, about terms and conditions.
Yeah, the reason we put this in, well, it comes in from the practice note, so I thought it was quite important to just you know, for people to see this because it asks these questions. When you're looking at ordering a climate risk search, and it says this, who can rely on the search? Is it just the solicitor or the client or a lender? Now, under the Landmark terms and conditions, it's all of those. Then it's the next, if a seller or landlord orders a search for potential buyers or tenants, who can rely on the search? It's got those. Is it just the buyers, the tenant solicitor, or the buyer, or the tenant, and the lender? Again, all of those people, all of those parties can rely on it. PI cover, what do we provide? Search provider provide. In our case, it's £10 million, so ample coverage there. Does it include an analysis of the findings? Absolutely, yes. And Ali was explaining, just taking that example with the coastal erosion, how much data sits behind it, a huge amount. And do we have a helpline? Yes. And I think this is where we probably excel as a company with our amazing customer sales team, who are brilliant and can answer the questions really well. So that's going to, I think we're set up as well as we can be, both with our reports and the sort of support going around the reports.
Absolutely, yeah. So this just really to sort of finish off, just is explaining the various reports that Landmark have where you can find climate change in, or if you prefer, without. So our residential reports, EnviroSearch and Risk View Residential, both now include climate change risk information, and it is that basically we've taken our separate report and put that data and analysis within these reports. So, you know, if your clients are aware of that you're going to cover climate risk and, you know, they're happy to have it, then these reports are ideal. It's got that information in it. If they've got a preference not to have it, or you feel that there's not a necessity and you'd like to keep it separate, then we have, as a residential report, the home check report, which you can then add climate change if you want to, so depending on which ones you use. Similarly, with our commercial reports, we've got site check combined, and that's got climate change report within it as standard. But again, if you prefer to use the site check assess report for just your standard environmental report and add climate for as and when a client requires it, then you can do that as well. And then our premium reports, which are site solutions reports, you know, it's again, we like to think that we've stuck to that flexibility, to that choice piece, and that means that if you select a site solutions commercial combined, you simply add climate change for as and when you or your client decides that that's what they'd like to be included. Every front page of whether that's environmental report or a particular climate change report is very clear. You know, it's landscape design now, so it's easy to see on screen, and a quick summary and identification of whether you need to check on what that information holds to relate to your client. And that's held within those executive summary pages. As you can see here, it's about reading all the sections and understanding And there's lots of links to explain exactly what, to remind you what an RCP is, etc., or any recommendations of, to follow further information. Yeah, and importantly, continue your learning. Would you say, Simon?
Yeah, we've set something up called the Landmark Academy. I think at least 10 years ago now, Ali, isn't it? So it's a fairly long time. We have some really good materials on there. In relation to climate change, we have a 4-part webinar series, about 20 minutes each, by Professor Bob Lee, which is fantastic. So if you're saying you want people in your firm just to have a better understanding of climate risk, then you couldn't go to a better place than go to Landmark Academy and listen to Bob's 4-part series. He goes right back to basics and kind of goes on from there, obviously in more detail than we've had time to talk about today. And it's not so much about, a little bit on searches, but it's just more about climate risk generally in the background. Things like, you know, the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, things like that are covered there.
Yeah, and that QR code then takes you to the climate change practice note video with Simon and Professor Bob Lee, which was published recently, which is, you know, kind of them talking through it, for another example if you want to share with your teams. And if the other QR code there is for getting onto the Landmark Academy, which is free to register and use. And I think that's it. So
that's it.
Over to questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed there to our subject matter experts, Ali Parsons and Simon Boyle from our friends at Landmark Information. Some worrying trends identified there, but a range of practical recommendations for conveyancers to manage risks for their clients and hopefully mitigate any risks of their own liability. We did say there'd be plenty of time at the end for questions, so do please make use of the chat function and post any questions which haven't already been answered in these presentations. To kick us off, we've had some questions already submitted by attendees. Firstly, we've been asked, how do you envisage advising on climate change risks will change in the future? And I suppose that I might as well add the obligatory reference to AI and whether or not you see AI becoming an increasing part of climate risk assessment or pre-purchase survey advice going forwards.
Yes. Shall I start with that one then, Ali?
Yes, please.
Okay, so yeah, actually a point I meant to make on this was where the Law Society has issued practice notes in the past, and in particularly I'm thinking about the contaminated land so-called warning card that came out in 2000, 25 years ago, crikey. There's been very little change actually in in updating that practice note. Occasionally it's updated slightly, but nothing substantially. With climate risk and the climate risk practice note, I think it will have to be revised quite frequently, probably every 2 or 3 years, because we're going into an unknown area. I've been following climate risk for, well, probably about 30 years, but certainly say 15 years ago, nobody was talking about the Greenland ice sheet collapsing. It just wasn't on people's radars. And now we know it's happening. And so much of this we're finding with climate change that it's accelerating much faster than anybody suspected. And so, in a couple of years' time, we're bound to find out other things. So probably big wildfires. I mean, obviously, I hope not, but we could have a big wildfire in the UK or something like that, and water stress, more water stress areas. So we will have to come back and revisit this, I'm pretty sure, and it probably won't be good news. As for using AI, we don't use AI presently in building our report. We're extracting data for building our reports, but currently we don't use AI in building our reports. I think that is bound to change. Inevitably, we will be using AI. I guess it'd just be more sophisticated in terms of the data it can assess. Possibly new types of risks will be looked at. Interestingly, talking about AI, obviously you need data centers to do all this work. And data centers are a massive user of water. So, if your client is in the data center business and thinking, where do I put my new data center? The advice should be don't go to a water stressed area because there may not be enough water for them to run it in a few years' time. But yeah, that we're going to see, I think this is going to be an ever evolving area. We'll see a lot more use of AI, and we'll be using it at Landmark. I have to say, whenever I use AI, when I write an essay or something, I get it to check, and I find it, oh, you just cannot rely on AI, can you? You just think, what's this nonsense it's providing? But you know, it's clearly it's going to go far. AI, it's the world we'll be living in.
Thank you very much. Well, unless Alison has anything she wanted to say on that. You were talking about climate risk obviously increasing. So something like flood risk assessments, which historically have looked at something like a 1 in 100-year storm. Is that being adjusted for climate change? So you mentioned Landmark's model is assuming a 4.5% increase in risk on the basis of current trends. But how is a 1 in 100-year storm assessed against that model? And is that assessment being recalibrated to a given date or even future projections? So do you make the extent of a 1 in 100-year storm much more severe, or do you just re-rate that storm to a 1 in 50 or a 1 in 10 or a 1 in 5?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That is a very good question. It's not just a case of looking at the historic flood risk and going, oh, it's going to get a bit worse, we'll change the percentage. It's not that. It's looking at the latest Met Office data. Is that UK CP18, Ali? Is that right?
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
That's the database we look at. So it's largely driven by what the Met Office is saying by this when they're forecasting using climate change. And obviously, they're using very, very powerful computers to do that. So we're basically picking up on the Met Office data for that. So there's a lot of modeling going on, and we'll continue to be, and they're reshaping it. But that is a good question because it isn't just going, all right, it's 1 in 100 now, and it's going to be 1 in 50. So let's just change this data. No, it's absolutely not doing that. It's UK using the UK CP18, which is the most advanced data that the Met Office have. That's what we use at Landmark.
Thank you very much. I think we've hopefully got time just for one more, although it's not necessarily a quick question. We've been asked, how do you think that the current backlash against climate change related targets will affect your risk assessments?
Yes. Well, I don't think they will affect our risk assessments. Our risk assessments are done on, we've just been talking about what the Met Office projections are. And obviously, we're looking at transition risks depending on what the government is producing. If the government is producing new laws affecting property on energy performance, that will obviously update the report there. The fact that that the Trump administration is, say, taking a very different approach to climate change, say, from the Biden administration, doesn't really affect how we work because we're using how the climate is behaving. So I don't think that's going to affect us at all. I mean, if countries are scaling back on their net zero targets and going, well, actually, and we're hearing this, of course, politically in the UK as well. Obviously, we're still committed to the Climate Change Act, but we're hearing what some political, well, say the Conservative Party, coming back and not saying, we're not going to meet it. We need to row back on that. Well, we'll see what happens. At the moment, it's still in law. The trouble is, if we do start all rowing back and going, it's too hard to meet these commitments, climate change is just going to get worse. Climate change isn't going, well, sorry, we'll scale back as well because to give you a bit more time, that's just not how it works. It's just the physical reality. Going back to that Al Gore description, it's an inconvenient truth. It's just happening, whether we like it or not. The acid test of climate change is atmospheric CO2, and that's what really determines the whole thing. Pre-industrial levels of CO2 were 280 parts per million. We know this well. We had records there, and we can go right back for hundreds of thousands of years looking at the Antarctic ice cores. I think they go back 500,000 years. And now it's at 429 parts per million, and it's increasing about 3 parts per million every year. So that's the scale of the problem. And CO2 is a global warmer. Some people still don't believe that to be the case, but any climate scientist, just got to read the IPCC report, and it's very, very clear what's happening. So
I think in putting it into everyday perspective and what we at Landmark produce to support climate change risk knowledge, it's like, sadly, it is an evolving thing. It's apparently not going to stop or slow down. But our reports will constantly try to get, we're about keeping up with the data. So using people like Met Office and stuff is exactly where we need to be. They won't stop looking at it, and we won't stop looking at it, even if the government say, we got to slow down, because probably funding has got a lot to do with it. So yeah, I think when you're looking at a property transaction, it's still an important part, and I think people that buy properties know that as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both very much. So thank you to our speakers, Ali Parsons and Simon Boyle from Landmark Information. We've just tipped over our hour. Thank you very much for all of our participants and attendees who've sent in questions. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Wish you a very good rest of your day.
Thank you.